Hey, welcome to this month's installment of Welcome to the Table. So glad to have you joining us. If you're new to the podcast, I want to encourage you to check out our introductory podcast. That's episode 0, just so you can learn a little bit about what this podcast is about, what our goal and our heart is for this, and why we even chose the name Welcome to the Table in the first place. My name's Khalil.
And my name is Sean.
And this is just a podcast about following Jesus in the midst of change and uncertainty and really trying to be better followers of Jesus. We know that this is a unique cultural moment, and all of us are really just trying to figure out how to navigate this, maybe for the first time in my life, personally.
Definitely.
Right? So just thanks for coming along the ride with us. And we have a special guest with us as well today.
Yeah, Brian Eno. It's kind of funny because I call him Brino, and he is actually the person that I'm taking over for at the Oregon Ministry Network of the Assemblies of God. Again, go to episode 0 if you want to hear a little bit more about that. But our church, Hope Church, has stolen him, and he's become our lead executive pastor. And then the network of churches in Oregon, the Assemblies of God churches,
they stole you.
They then, I guess, stole me. So we're so glad that he's here. First of all, before you kind of give us a little background on you, I just need to know, what's your favorite ice cream? I just need to know these things.
This is important.
It's very important.
I would say my favorite ice cream is probably vanilla. As crazy as that might sound, I'm kind of a plain guy when it comes to ice cream. I
Me
like vanilla,
too, Brian.
but I have a crazy twist to it, Khalil.
Oh.
I like to put maple syrup on it.
Oh, okay.
Maple syrup.
See, I've done
Maple's like
caramel.
pancake syrup. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that's good for all of our listeners to know.
I feel
Try it.
better
And so-
for all the people
Don't
who
hate it
judge
until
me
you try.
I know.
for vanilla.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I don't want to spoil any of it, but I know you have been such a staple in our state, not just with the Assemblies of God churches, but you've been so faithful and served leaders and served kids pastors, youth pastors, and churches, and just an awesome role model of character and integrity. So, but just tell us a little bit about you and maybe your family.
Sure. Yeah, I'm married to
Yes.
my beautiful bride, Barbara. We have one adult son, and we have lived in Oregon for about 21 years.
Wow.
We've served in ministry really all our adult life since we've been married. We served in San Diego originally as on staff, youth pastors. She was involved in kids ministries. She also was involved in worship. The Lord moved us to Oregon. We ended up in Central Oregon, beautiful place called Bend, Oregon, where we went on staff as associates, again, focusing on youth. And my wife was the worship leader at the time. And then we moved to the network, the role that you're stepping into.
Mm-hmm.
We stepped into that role about 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was a brand new role at the time. They really redesigned how it looked. And so we had the privilege of kind of helping design it and make it our own. And so we did that for 12 years, served our churches, served our youth pastors and our kids pastors, really pastoring pastors, coaching, mentoring, training, and some event planning, obviously. And then the Lord brought us here. So like you said, it's kind of like a baseball trade. And so that's kind of what I tell people, they stole us and the network stole you. So
Yeah.
but we're excited about what God's doing, and glad to be here at the table with both you and Khalil.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we try to do is it's just we want to bring people in who are kind of in the trenches, average, everyday people who are either pastoring or not pastoring or volunteering, and just have you guys talk about topics and issues within culture that is relatable and practical, and how to do life, how to be a follower amidst all of that. So we're grateful that you're here to share with us. So the topic we have for you is generosity, basically.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we wanted to have you come on just to talk with us about generosity is because, I think when I think of you, I think of this idea of generosity in so many ways. Generosity isn't just money. Mm-hmm. It's authority, it's leadership, it's life. It affects all of our life. And as the district youth director for our state, you were also a huge voice for missions and missions giving in kids ministry and youth. So we just thought it'd be fun to kind of explore this idea of generosity, what it means for us and really what it looks like as a follower of Jesus to live a life that's defined by generosity.
Mm-hmm. I would actually, a question just popped in my head. What do you think culturally in the West generosity looks like? What do you think it means to be generous? Your average run-of-the-mill American, maybe they're a Christian, maybe they're not. Maybe they think they are, maybe they're totally anti. What does it look like? And I know it's a total curveball, but what do you think that looks like or that means?
I would agree with what Khalil said. I think most people connect generosity with money. Mm-hmm. And if they're givers, if they give to charity, they put something in the red kettle at Christmas time, then they're generous.
Yeah.
But obviously, generosity is much larger than that and much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And certainly the way God would describe generosity in his word is completely, that's a small portion of it.
Okay. So what does it look like then to be generous according to the scriptures? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I think generosity looks like living your life open-handed. You can live your life two ways. You can live your life closed-handed, where everything you walk around and everything's closed. You don't want to share it. You don't want to open it because you're afraid someone's going to take it or steal it or you're going to be without.
Yeah.
Or you can live your life open-handed, where everything's open and you're willing to share, you're willing to give, you're willing to help. That's generosity. Open-hand living is generosity in my mind. No one taught me more about generosity than my wife. Now, God used my wife, so obviously God taught me, but he used my wife to teach me generosity early on in our relationship. I grew up in a home that we didn't have a whole lot, and so my dad died young, so we were single family, single parent income, and so we didn't have a whole lot. We didn't get a lot of new things. And I brought that into my adulthood and even into my relationship with my wife before she was my wife. And she saw that real quick that I was very stingy, might be the word she would use, very generous, might be another way to say I might like to use that term. But regardless, I remember having a conversation with her before we were married about finances. And she caught on quickly that I wasn't, that this was a hold on me, this of not wanting to share and feeling like I have to hold on to everything tight. And I remember her one time telling me, Brian, if that's how it's going to be, I don't know that I want to marry you. Wow. Now, it's interesting because I used to think that it was based on my childhood, but my wife grew up in a very similar situation, and she wasn't that way. So it doesn't have to be that way. But she did teach me to be generous and to begin to live in an open-handed lifestyle.
That's really good.
Well, I relate to that, too, because I grew up in a single-parent home and an only child. So what was mine was mine, And growing up, I didn't grow up in the church either. So as I encountered church and faith and the life of Jesus and people who were just stronger followers of Jesus and were defined by generosity, it really challenged me. So I really resonate with that.
So, Brian, another curveball. You're welcome. What is the difference between frugality and stinginess, if there is any?
Ooh.
And frugality would be wise living, would be considered that. You're frugal with your finances or your money. You're a good trustee. Yeah. I would say, not my definition. I would say that is how people would see it. It's perceived as. That's what frugality is.
Well, I think some people use the term frugal because they don't want to use the word stingy.
Okay, good.
If that makes sense. But I think where you're going, and I think there is a difference if you don't want to use it as an excuse to say I'm stingy. To me, that in my mind, the difference could be as simple as stingy is I trusting everything I have is relies on me. Okay. I'm trusting in myself to provide for myself and take care of myself. Frugality is just wise living. I think you kind of said that, and it's tied to this. I'm not going to just go throw my money away. I'm not going to use it senselessly and foolishly. I'm still trusting God, but I also recognize that He gave me everything, and I have a responsibility to use it wisely. And part of that using that wisely is being generous. So I don't think those are oxymorons, being generous and being frugal.
Okay.
But I do think being generous and being stingy are complete opposites.
Something they say
that's
about like younger millennials and even Gen Z is we're very emotional givers. So when moved emotionally, then there's maybe a big act of generosity, which again, not a bad thing. I love that we're moved, but also they're connecting it to the foolishness, maybe as if it's unplanned or it's just, I don't know, exorbitant or something. Letting it be tied to emotion might be a way that, I'm just connecting it with what you were saying a little bit. That popped into my mind.
Well, and I think that there's a little bit of that term we hear often. I think we used it the other day when we were crossing in the hallway, of that reverse mentoring. The millennials, I think you're right. The younger generation, millennials, maybe even Gen Z, but much more emotionally, their giving is tied to their emotions. We as an older generation, I'm putting myself in that, can learn from that. We can learn from that of, man, I need to be more spontaneous in my generosity and let my emotions help me with that.
It's a good perspective.
But I think our older generations, and I put myself into that, we can be less that way, and we can be more matter of fact. I give to these organizations, I help in these ways just because that's what I do. And it's more of a commitment, it's more of a faithfulness, it's more of a regularity, and that's the right word. I don't think that's the right word, but it's like a routine. Yeah. Routine, that's the better word.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And I think the younger generation can learn from that because sometimes they can be like, well, if I'm not moved by it, I'm not going to give.
Right.
Well, the need's still real regardless if you feel it or not.
That's a great point.
That's a really good point.
So we can learn from both sides.
That's really good. So, to me, as I kind of think about culturally, and at least from what I observe, to me, I kind of feel like there's a cultural dichotomy in regards to generosity. And what I mean by that is it seems like in our culture, generosity is an espoused value, right? We say we should be generous. We should give. We should take care of one another. We should be others oriented. That seems like a value that a lot of people in our culture would say they believe. And yet at the same time, it seems like it's absent from a lot of people's lives, or at least it's not planned, or it happens kind of happenstance. Like you said, when the red bucket comes out around Christmas time, there's my giving, but it's not so much always a lifestyle. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at is this lifestyle of generosity. And I know we'll explore this a little bit more later, but I just want to ask, why do you think God cares so much about generosity?
Well, I think God's whole story, his story is a story of generosity. I mean, if you read the Bible, which reveals his story, it's all about generosity. All the way back to the first verse, think of it this way, the most popular verse in all the Bible is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave. Right. Generosity is in the most popular verse in all the Bible. I tell people often, especially younger generations, but it doesn't matter. Any generation can hear this. You're never more like Jesus than when you're giving. You're never more like God when you're giving. Jesus was the exact representation of God. Matter of fact, I wanted to read it to you. I wrote it down. It's Hebrews 1:3 says, the Son, speaking of Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. So he represented Jesus, God the Father, exactly on this earth. And he gave his life. He gave his all. Oh. And the Father gave his Son. Yeah. So generosity is his story. And I just want to add one other thing.
Go ahead,
because I think Khalil said it there, is that generosity is not a destination. It's part of your life. It's the journey. It's your lifestyle. And that's what my wife had to teach me. I didn't struggle giving in the sense of where I knew I was supposed to. Where I struggled is having a lifestyle of giving when I first met her.
We're talking, and you mentioned it earlier too, and I kind of want to unpack it a little more. We're talking more than just money, monetary giving. Jesus gave his life. We see this. He's the exact image bearer of Creator God, of God. And then we then become the image bearers. And so we need to follow likewise. But it's more than just money, like you said.
Absolutely.
How do you see Jesus representing generosity in ways other than just money?
Yeah,
because in the
that's a good one.
scriptures, as I read the New Testament, which is all about Jesus and his life in the Gospels, we actually don't really see Jesus giving money necessarily, yet we're describing him as generous. So that might frame it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Jesus gave his life. He was kind. That's an act of generosity, is to be kind to people, helping people. The Bible says that God is love. That's one of the ways we describe God, is that he is love. Not that he loves, but that he is love. That's his essence. That's his being. Jesus is the full representation of God. We already said that. So he's obviously walking love on the earth. That's who he was. That's what he did. There's a verse in where Paul says this to the church of Corinthians, verse 1. And I read this yesterday, and I thought it's fitting for what we're talking about. I'd like to read it to you. Yeah. It's verses 7 and 8. It's in the famous, what we might call the love chapter, the chapter we like to read at weddings. But verse 7 and 8 says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Think of those two words that are repeated there often, all and never. Those are generous words. Those words are words of generosity.
Right.
All represents everything. It's open hand living. Never means I never close my hand. I live that way all the time. That's the way God exists, and that's the way Jesus exists. And so his whole life demonstrates that. When you read the four Gospels, the biographies of Jesus, you see his generosity in there.
That's really good. That love should be something that we generously give.
Absolutely.
Kindness, compassion.
Those are all gifts.
It's great.
Of generosity.
As you were reading that passage from Corinthians, the word endures jumped out to me. And I don't know if prior to this conversation, I would have thought of enduring as an act of generosity, even. It's an act of love as defined right there. But since love is generous, there's that connection. And that challenges me in just personal relationships, bearing with one another, how I engage and interact with people as we cross shoulder to shoulder, just happen to pass by one another in life. And all of us know what it is to be in a position or be around someone that maybe you try to slip away from the moment, or part of you wants to be elsewhere. Yet love and even generosity, there's a generosity with your time to bear with someone. And that just really jumped out, maybe even for the first time for me, just as you read that.
Yeah, that time component is very important too. And I know we've talked a little bit about the money issue side of things. We've talked a little bit about frugality. We've talked a little bit about generosity outside of just money and gifts. So what are some practical ways for us to live a generous lifestyle? What does that look like practically, especially in our current climate in culture in our nation?
I'm glad you asked that, because I'm a practical person. Whenever I listen to podcasts, whenever I read, I'm looking for the practicality of it. How do I apply this to my life?
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you just asked that.
Definitely.
When it comes to generosity, I like to look at it this way. God wants us to be generous with the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. Well, we spend a lot of time talking about treasure. Treasure's money. It's our possessions, our material possessions. But we also possess time, and we also possess talent. So I mean, think about it like this. We all have the same amount of hours in a week. We all have 168 hours in a week. How are we using our time?
Yeah.
Are we generous with our time? Khalil kind of talked about that a little bit ago. Are we generous with our time? I heard someone challenge me once, and I don't say that I live by this all the time, but I think of it from time to time. We understand this concept as Christ followers and people who live by the words in the Bible. This idea of tithing, that's usually tied to finances. We tithe. We give 10% of our income to the Lord. What if we looked at that way with our time? What if we tithed their time?
Interesting.
That would represent about 17 hours a week. Are we using 17 hours a week of tithe to give to the Lord in our time? Are we spending that? That could include the time we spend with Him, but it also could include the time we serve for Him. It could being kind and helping in that type of thing. But I think the question we need to ask often is, am I using my time for the Lord, and am I generous with my time?
Mm-hmm.
Time is a very precious commodity, and none of us can get it back. So how do we use it?
Truth.
Are we using it right?
That's a great challenge, especially when I think about our current time and the pace at which we live, which is why we've talked about Sabbath in our podcast. We want to talk about living in an unhurried life shortly, but when the pace seems so fast, time might seem like a greater shortage than money even. If you live with a stingy mentality or a closed-handedness, I love that image, am I living closed-handed or open-handed, then the temptation is to say, I don't have enough time for this. I don't have enough time to do that. I would love to, but I don't have enough. And again, you touched on it earlier. That would even come back to not trusting God with our time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So time is one. And like I said, we already talked about treasure, so we won't go back there. But talent. I think we need to be generous with our talent. We all have different gifts. God's gifted us uniquely and individually, and he expects us and desires for us as his followers to use our talent to build his kingdom and to serve his purposes. And so are we using that talent, whatever that talent might be? If it be a musical talent, if it be an art talent, if it be a service talent. My wife has a talent or a gift. Some people might use that as the gift of hospitality. Are we using that? Are we welcoming people in our home?
Yeah.
Are we using our talents, and are we generous with them, or are we stingy with them?
And to that point, do we even know what we are gifted in? Do we know what lights a fire? Do we know what those innate giftings and passions and talents that Jesus has gifted all of us, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not? It doesn't matter. Everybody has been graciously given, generously, at least one thing that they're very gifted and talented in. How do we assess that? Do you even know what those are? And I know there's some different assessment tools out there, and there's lots of different ways. We don't have to talk about all those, but maybe one of your favorites assessments.
One of my favorite assessments is and I think it's favorite because it's simple and it's easy to remember.
Good.
And and it's not original to me. I believe I first heard it from Rick Warren, Pastor Rick Warren out of Saddleback Church, in one of his books. Might have been Purpose Driven Life, but he talked about the idea that God has shaped each one of us individually, uniquely, and he expects us to use that shape and give that shape back to him to build his kingdom and fulfill his purposes. And he uses the word shape as I think it's an acrostic is the right word, where each letter represents something. And so I'll go through it real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Shape, S stands for spiritual gifts. What are the spiritual gifts God's given you since your salvation, since being born again? Something you didn't have before salvation. H stands for heart, and you kind of said that, Pastor Sean, that it's that what gets your heart pumping. What are you passionate about? A stands for abilities, those natural abilities that you were born with. You've always had them prior to salvation and since salvation. Like, for instance, a natural ability that I've always had as long as I can remember is this ability to organize chaos. I've done that as a little kid. Go into my room, if it was chaotic, I would want to organize and straighten it out.
I'll vouch for that.
So
man.
that's just P is personality. P stands for personality. It's God's given you a personality, and it's how you use your gift. So maybe you have a gift of teaching, but your personality is such that you would use that gift more in a small group setting than in a large gathering on a stage. So your personality plays into that. And I think that the last one, E, is so important, is your experiences, because your experiences shape you too.
True.
Khalil and I shared about how we have some past experiences that are similar. Right. Well, I know for me, growing up in a fatherless home has shaped the kind of man I've become, the kind of husband I am, the kind of father I am. Yeah. It's shaped me, and so all the good and the bad experiences make up your shape. But those, I think, when you bring those together, then you can realize, okay, that's how God wants to use my life, and He wants me to be generous in my life in that way.
That's good.
It's good.
It's really good.
And on experiences, you said they help shape you, but even negative experiences, I would just add this: don't have to define you.
Absolutely.
And I think as we grow in our relationship with Jesus, the identity that He gives us should be what defines us above and beyond our past. Because like we just said, we're connecting part of our past story to some of the stinginess maybe that entered our heart. But obviously that has been redefined, and we've grown out of that. God's done that in our lives. So that's really great to see.
But even the experience I had with my wife, where she said,
Right.
I don't know if I want to be married to you if you're this way.
That's not a
That
positive
was part
one.
of the experience, too.
That's not positive.
And it wasn't positive at that moment, but it surely shaped the kind of person I am today.
Yeah.
And teaching me to live open-handed.
This is so
That's
good.
awesome,
This
man.
is such good stuff. And man, as followers of Jesus, Sean touched on it. We are image bearers. That we are never more like God than when we are generous. This is His
Absolutely.
character. It's His nature. It defines who God is. And we want to be the same way. I don't want to get to the end of my life and have people remember me as stingy. I'd rather them remember me as generous and them see Jesus through that. So, Brian, if I were listening right now, and let's say a teenager wanting to get started for the first time, or a young adult,
Right.
or even a parent today that's saying, I want to step into this generous life, what's a good starting point?
Just start. Just start being generous. We understand tithing. We kind of talked about that a little bit already.
Right.
In the Old Testament, one of the things the Lord told the Israelites was that they had to leave a portion of their land
Right.
for the wanderers, for the alien who come in, so that they could glean. And I think one of the terms in the Old Testament is to leave a corner of your land for the alien, the less fortunate, the one who's wandering through and needs something.
Yeah.
Now think of it like this. He says to leave a corner of it in the Old Testament, but he doesn't define how big of a corner.
It's good.
I've always remembered that when I heard that and read that, is that we determine how big the corner is. We can have a very sliver, tiny corner, or we can be very generous and make a very big corner. It's up to us. God doesn't tell us how big the corner needs to be. He just says you should leave a corner for the less fortunate. I want to leave a bigger corner. I want to live my life always expanding the corner so that I'm being more and more generous, if that makes sense.
That's tweetable.
And I think
Expand the
you
corner.
start where you're at, and then as the Lord teaches you, you can continue to pull back on what I need and where I can be more generous and enlarge my corner of giving.
Enlarge the corner. I love that. That's really cool.
That's great. And yeah, so starting in some way with our time, what does that look like? In some way with the use of our talents, and in some way with the treasure and the possessions that we have. That's really great. You mentioned a couple different things, the Purpose-Driven Life book, the SHAPE assessment, and the Time, Talent, Treasure. We're going to put that in the show notes so that people can find those things if they want to look back and kind of explore that a little bit more. But my biggest takeaway is the difference between close-handed or living, or a shortage mindset, and open-handed living, which is a trusting in God and trusting that He's going to provide all sufficiency, which comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, which might be a chapter worth looking at as well if you're listening and you want to look at something in your personal time. But wow, Brian, thank you so much
Yes, thank you.
for joining us.
Well, thanks for letting me sit at the table, Pastor Sean.
Yeah.
Pastor Khalil. It's been an honor to be here with you guys and just talk about generosity, something that's dear to my heart.
Yeah.
And it has really grown over the 12 years that I served in that network position for the Assemblies of God. So look forward for the future, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for hanging with us. And if you would like to hear all of our podcasts, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. That way you don't miss one. And feel free to give us a rating, and look in the show notes as well for some of the things, the resources that were talked about here. And until then, who are you inviting to your table?